Tonight on the Daily Debrief, the man who admits he kidnapped Jamie Kloss after killing her parents is speaking out from his jail cell. Why did he do it? Plus, singer R. Kelly is trying to get out of the slammer after an arrest for failing to pay child support. Also, sentencing for the president's former campaign chair. And
a farmer puts a seed and fertilizer into the ground and then waits for Mother Nature to produce her bounty.
But it's the seed of evil when it's a son accused of murder on the farm. Does the state have the wrong man?
Now he's in that chair, unable to take the time to grieve.
The nation's top criminal cases are on the Daily Debrief. It's Friday, March 8th. And good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Debrief. Aaron Keller, along with Law&Crime President Rachel Stockman. Let's get straight to the news. The man who admitted to police he murdered the family of a Wisconsin girl has penned a bizarre jailhouse letter to a Minnesota television station. In it, he says he doesn't think like a serial killer and tries to apologize. According to court documents, Jamie Kloss disappeared for 88 days after watching this man, Jake Patterson, kill her parents. He took her, authorities say, to his home where he held her. Patterson recently waived a preliminary hearing, but has not entered an official plea. However, he's speaking from prison. In a letter to a Minneapolis television station, Patterson says, "I knew when I was caught, which I thought would happen a lot sooner, I wouldn't fight anything. I tried to give them everything. Then scribbles, wasn't completely honest, so they didn't have to interview Jamie. They did anyways and hurt her more for no reason." The letter is filled with scribbled thoughts, but Patterson says he plans to plead guilty. "I want Jamie and her relatives to know that. Don't want them to worry about a trial." When responding to a question from a reporter about what led him to kidnap Kloss in the first place, Patterson said, "It's not black and white." When asked if he had remorse, Patterson said, "Huge amounts. Then, I can't believe I did this." Patterson refused to detail his long-term plans after he admits he kidnapped Jamie. But he did take a swipe at the authorities.
88 days ago, we stood before you speaking about the unthinkable tragedy.
The cops say I planned this thoroughly and that I said that. They're really good at twisting your words around, put them in different spots, straight up lie. Little mad about that. Trying to cover up their mistakes, I guess. This was mostly on impulse. I don't think like a serial killer. When asked what was going through his mind when he started perpetrating the crime, Patterson said he was angry and didn't want to do it, but the reason I did this is complicated. Then he apologized multiple times to Jamie Kloss, the girl now living with a relative, her parents both dead. Joining me tonight on the Debrief is Law&Crime President Rachel Stockman. So, Rachel, this letter gives us somewhat of a picture inside this defendant's mind, but do we really want to be inside his mind?
No, it's just so messed up. I mean, honestly, all of what he said that you just reviewed, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, to be honest.
You know, some of it does, and it's clear when he starts to write something and then scribbles it out and then says, "Oh, I wasn't being honest." Like, he's sort of crafting his own narrative in the letter as he goes, and there's evidence of it.
He's figuring it out as he goes. And it's interesting, too, that he decided, from what I understand, this was a local news reporter who had written to him in jail, and he responded. He just decided that this was going to be his outlet of when he's going to respond. I have to say it's not entirely unusual, but I think it's unusual in the fact that it was before the case had been adjudicated.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he still has a plea hearing coming up, which, of course, we plan to cover here. He apologized to Kloss over and over again, says he just could not control himself. This sounds a lot like the Chris Watts recordings we heard yesterday. These people who say they did it, but it was like I couldn't control myself.
But in Chris Watts, I hate to say it because it's such a horrible case, that you can at least understand that in terms of being angry. This happened. He kept her for all of this time. He couldn't control himself all of these months. He kept her captive.
It's a disturbing distinction, but there is a distinction nonetheless. I'll agree there. He also is taunting the authorities here as if he's so smart, but then he doesn't really explain exactly where he claims they went wrong.
Exactly. In all of these cases, I find it's very hard to understand people that would do something quite this sick to anyone.
We have another window in his mind. Rachel, we'll check in again with you in a moment. The subject of the popular true crime podcast Serial will not have his second chance at legal redemption. Maryland's highest court ruled late today that Adnan Syed will not receive a second trial for the murder of his high school girlfriend. The court agreed that Syed's defense was deficient, but that his original legal counsel's poor representation is just not enough to warrant a retrial of the case. Syed's case was profiled in the podcast Serial, of course, which raised questions about the handling of his original case. R&B singer R. Kelly is trying to get out of jail after his arrest this week for failing to pay child support. Kelly asked a judge today to reduce the amount of child support he owes his ex-wife. The judge could take days to decide. Kelly currently owes $161,000. Kelly's request comes as he simultaneously denies having sex with underage women. Prosecutors in Chicago charged Kelly with 10 counts of sex abuse. They say they have videotapes to prove it. President Trump's former campaign chairman has been sentenced to 47 months in prison. A jury convicted Paul Manafort of defrauding banks and the government and failing to pay taxes on millions of dollars he earned through political consulting in the Ukraine. The judge could have given Manafort a 25-year sentence, but did not. The recommended sentence was actually 19 to 25 years. Manafort will be sentenced next week by a different judge for witness tampering and conspiracy. Opening statements this afternoon in the case of an Iowa man accused of murdering his mother over money. Jason Carter is the defendant. Shirley Carter is the victim. Jason's father sued him in civil court after Shirley's death. A jury ruled in the father's favor and awarded him $10 million. Prosecutors stepped in and filed criminal charges against Jason, citing evidence from the civil trial. So this case has been a little bit backwards procedurally. A prosecutor told the jury the defendant's timeline matches up with the time of the killing and that his behavior raised suspicions before and during a 911 call.
It's 11:11 when the phone rings at the Marion County Dispatch Center. The defendant's the caller. He says he just found his mother lying on the floor. He sounds upset, very upset, and he says to the 911 dispatcher, "There's blood everywhere." Later, that would seem odd to investigators because, as we'll learn, there was blood. But most of the blood is underneath Shirley's body and not something you see if you just walk in the door. We'll also learn that the evidence will establish that at 11:08, for some reason, the defendant called and talked to his sister 3 minutes before he calls 911. He said he found his mother dead. His sister was quickly just as frantic as the defendant was acting. She asked him, "Have you called 911?" And he said he had not, and he was resistant to the idea.
After authorities arrived, the prosecutor said the defendant seemed to know way too much about what happened.
The EMT checked on Shirley and quickly determined there was nothing that could be done to save her. And being careful not to compromise the scene, he took Bill and the defendant outside. Outside, him and the defendant talked. Now, the EMT hadn't seen any bullet wounds in Shirley because her clothing was covering her clothes. Her clothing was covering her wounds. So later, it would seem extremely odd to investigators that within hours of this crime, the evidence will establish that the defendant knew his mother had been shot. The defendant knew she had been shot with a rifle. The defendant knew been shot with a rifle owned by his father. Been shot with a rifle owned by his father during an attempted burglary. And the defendant knew been shot with a rifle owned by his father during an attempted burglary, and the shooter took the rifle with him when he left. The defendant knew all that before Shirley Carter's body was ever removed from the scene.
Prosecutors said the defendant staged his mother's room to look like a burglary occurred, but that jewelry, money, guns, and even opioid medication, which is valuable, were never stolen. The motive was something else, prosecutors say. The defendant needed money.
A farmer puts a seed and fertilizer into the ground and then waits for Mother Nature to produce her bounty. And during that time, they sometimes have very little income coming in. So they live on their credit line. The trick is to live within your means. And we'll learn the defendant didn't do that. He splurged on new equipment. His spending was catching up with him. On the day of Shirley's murder, the defendant's business, Broadview Farms, had a credit line of $575,000. The defendant and his wife had signed personal guarantees in addition to farm guarantees, meaning the assets of the farm went first if you weren't able to pay your loan, and then your personal assets were next up. On the day of the homicide, their business account and their personal accounts both had less than $100 in them. And the credit line, it was nearly tapped out. The highest it had ever been borrowed against in the lifetime of Broadview Farms. And things were about to get a whole lot worse. One of his largest landlords, who he rents land from, 750 acres worth, a third of his total operation, well, the landlord has passed away. And her son isn't interested in having the defendant farm the property anymore. He's just going to sell it.
The defense pointed to so-called gaping holes in the state's investigation. Among them, a statement from the victim's husband, the defendant's father, which suggests the state's timeline is just hogwash.
We're going to talk about another statement, too, and that's the statement of Bill Carter Sr., who arrives on the scene, grabs his wife, holds her, and thereafter says she was stiff as a board. She was in rigor mortis. And I know what rigor mortis is. And Bill Carter says, I know what rigor mortis is. I was a butcher. She was stiff as a board. She was cold. And I believe everyone who testifies will agree that if that's true, it would be impossible for Jason Carter to have been the killer, because it simply puts it out of the time frame when he would have been there. There are a lot of questionable statements here. Another statement was made that Bill Carter arrived and then within 7 minutes ran to see if the pigs had been fed while his wife was on the floor. Ask yourself, does that time frame really make sense?
As to the financial motive pressed by the state, the defense says defendant Jason Carter was doing just fine, and the defense pointed at the defendant's older brother as another possible killer.
Immediately upon arriving at the scene, before knowing much of anything, Billy Carter Jr. says, do you think they used the .270 that I gave to Dad? Which is the suspected weapon in this case. And we'll talk about that too, because it's not definite that it's that weapon, but certainly there's a lot of evidence that indicates it is. But Billy Carter Jr. was the first person to ever mention that weapon in particular. I will say the state's right about one thing. They don't have to prove motive, but I do think you can look at, was there a motive? And I believe the evidence will show there wasn't. That Jason Carter was a son who loved his mother, spent a lot of time with her, and that now he's in that chair, unable to take the time to grieve because of some statements that have been taken out of context.
The defense continued that theme, saying there was no rancor in this family, especially between the defendant and his mother.
Bill Carter and Jana Carter and Billy Carter will all testify. And I believe they will all testify that Jason was over at the house, that he spent time with his mother, that his mother was proud of him, happy with him, that they were together often, and that none of them had seen friction, sadness, and that there had been no arguments asking for land, that there had been normal communication. And I believe the state's own expert is going to say that he didn't believe that this particular crime, whoever committed it, was committed as a planned thing, that he believed it was spontaneous, not planned, not decided, based on whatever evidence he reviewed.
Once again tonight to Law and Crime President Rachel Stockman, who's here along with me now. This is a really earthy trial. We've got cornfields, we've got butchers talking about rigor mortis and recognizing it. And we've got this piece of evidence that popped up, the suggested evidence that popped up during the openings, where the defendant said that he was lubricating some piece of farm equipment, and other farmers said, that doesn't look like it's been lubricated in months. This is going to be a really interesting trial because the local folks in Iowa know about all this, but the rest of us don't understand the mechanics.
Exactly, and some of the details we'd have no idea of distinguishing, but it makes a big difference if you know how all of this works on a farm.
You know, farm finance, of course, is an extremely complex topic, but it's not something we see frequently in murder trials. We're going to see it in this one.
Yeah, this is a fascinating case and a couple of different reasons why. One is that if you really look at the evidence, and we haven't seen it all, right, because the trial just started, but it's largely a circumstantial case. They really don't have a ton against Jason, besides, you know, some of these changing statements and that fingerprint on the gun case. At least that's not what we know. At least that's what we know. And you kind of hit on this, which is the defense attorney really pounding in the timeline and trying to prove that their version of the timeline exonerates her client.
Oftentimes these cases boil down to a timeline, and we're probably going to see competing timelines. The question is, how compelling is the story going to be told? Who's going to have the fancy
graphics?
Who has the
better timeline?
Yeah, exactly. Not only that, but who tells the story better? Because just getting up there and sort of reciting it in a more flat tone is not going to pound it home. Look, Rachel, we'll be back with you again at the end of the broadcast. But now to Chief Investigative Correspondent Brian Ross for a look at an all-new episode of Brian Ross Investigates.
Aaron, tonight on our program, Donald Trump under oath. Did he tell the truth when he tried to distance himself from a twice-convicted felon, once tied to the Russian mafia, who then became a senior advisor to Donald Trump?
If he were sitting in the room right now, I really wouldn't know what he looked like.
Isn't it true that President Trump knew convicted Russian mobster Felix Sater in 2013 when he made that statement?
Yes.
And the lawyer with a newborn who Trump castigated as horrible and disgusting because she wanted a break to use a breast pump.
I've been called worse things on the playground when I was 9.
All that coming up, Aaron, tonight on Brian Ross Investigates. Aaron?
Look forward to it. Still ahead tonight, a look back at this week's conviction of the plainclothes Florida police officer who shot and killed a stranded motorist. We're back inside the courtroom with that one when we return. Welcome back, everyone. The trial of a California man accused of killing a family of 4 will resume next week. Prosecutors say defendant Chase Merritt murdered his business partner, Joseph McStay, and McStay's entire family because he needed money. The state rested, but will reopen its case and call one more witness next week. So, court is on hold until then. Then it's the defense's turn. The McStay family disappeared in 2010. A dirt biker found their bodies buried in the desert in 2013. The owner of the New England Patriots will have to appear in court later this month on charges he solicited a prostitute. The charge is a misdemeanor, and it comes as part of a larger law enforcement investigation into alleged sex trafficking. Robert Kraft's arraignment is scheduled for March 28th, but his lawyer told Boston.com that he is not required to attend. Court documents, however, state the defendant, meaning Kraft, must be present for the hearing. Kraft is accused of paying women for sex acts at a day spa, including during the morning of the day the Patriots won an AFC championship game in Kansas City. A Florida police officer is headed to prison for shooting and killing a stranded African-American motorist. Jurors yesterday decided that Nouman was guilty as charged in the 2015 shooting death of Corey Jones. Jones's car broke down on an interstate exit ramp at 3 in the morning. Raja pulled up in front of him in an unmarked police vehicle and approached him without wearing a uniform. After a brief argument, Jones pulled a gun, so Raja shot him and tried to claim self-defense. The jury didn't buy any of that argument. Back to Rachel Stockman one last time here on Law and Crime. We haven't had a chance, you and I, to discuss this verdict, so what do you make of it?
I was surprised that they convicted him on the highest, most serious charge in this case, because I think that there was some reasonable doubt that the defense did a good job of creating.
I could see that, and I'm wondering, okay, look, what's going on in the defendant's head? Did he really mean to go out and do this? Was he looking for blood? And I don't buy that theory, but look, something was wrong there. He's rolling up, he's jumping out of the car, just disregarding all police protocol from any agency that I've ever dealt with.
But at the same time,
why would he be doing that?
It is an interesting question. At the same time, one of the things that the jurors had to weigh is the fact that Corey Jones did have a gun. And whether he was threatening or not, that is a hard fact to get over. And so you have to hand it to the prosecution and their ability to get the conviction on the highest charge here.
Yeah, I kept asking all the way through this case, who exactly is the first aggressor here? And I guess I've got to come down on Nouman because, again, why didn't he immediately flash the badge? Pull over in a more respectful tone. Even just pull up alongside the guy and put the badge out and say, hey, I'm a police officer, are you okay?
He was almost out of control, it sounded like, when he approached Corey Jones.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
I think the jurors probably saw that as well because we had that recording.
The recording was so damning to him as well.
And when his story doesn't match the recording, that's the big issue.
Exactly, and then you have that unique lens where you actually had him telling what happened to police, and we had that all on film, and you could tell, there were parts where it didn't seem like he was telling the truth.
He wasn't telling the truth, especially when you match it up with the recording, and the defense tried to get out from underneath it and say, okay, well, there's this other stuff that may have been there, the recording didn't catch, or it's inaudible. Well, the state didn't have it. Rachel Stockman, good to see you on the Debrief tonight.
Absolutely.
And thanks for watching this edition of the Debrief. To those of you watching from afar, I'll be back Monday at 5 o'clock Eastern here on Law and Crime with this nightly recap of the best moments of testimony in cases nationwide. Our live trial coverage begins at 9 o'clock Monday morning. Have a good weekend, everybody, and a good evening tonight.